The cabin was exactly what I needed. Secluded, quiet, tucked away in a dense stretch of forest where cell service didn't exist, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the November wind. I had come here to clear my head, to escape the noise of the city, and maybe to finish the short story that had been gnawing at my mind for months. The first few days were peaceful. I split logs for the fire, brewed coffee over a stovetop flame, and watched the sunset bleed into the tree line. By the third night, the isolation had started to feel comfortable, like a blanket you don't realize you needed. Then, on the fourth night, I saw it. I was sitting on the small porch, wrapped in a heavy jacket, staring out into the trees. The sky was overcast, moonlight only barely breaking through the clouds. The fire in the cabin crackled faintly behind me, warmth spilling out from the open door. At first I thought it was a shadow, something dark and low moving through the trees about 20 yards out. I squinted, leaning forward slightly. It was too far to make out details, but it moved again, deliberate, almost slow enough to seem unnatural. My pulse quickened. A deer, I told myself. Maybe a coyote. But then it stepped into the dim light from the cabin, and I froze. It was wrong. It looked like a deer, at least at first glance. Long, spindly legs, a narrow frame. But it was too thin, its ribs pushing against its hide in a way that made it seem sickly. Its head tilted slightly, jerky like a broken puppet. Its eyes didn't catch the light the way an animal's eyes should. They were flat, dull, and black. I stayed still, hoping it would lose interest and wander off. But instead, it stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, as if it was testing the ground with every step. Then it stopped and turned its head toward me. My breath caught. Its face wasn't quite right. The shape was there, but the details were wrong, like a bad imitation. Its nose was too narrow, its mouth too wide. The skin around it stretched and cracked as if it didn't quite fit. It watched me, unblinking, and I felt pinned under its gaze. I stood slowly, the wooden porch creaking beneath my boots. The thing didn't move, it just kept staring, its head cocking slightly to one side. I stepped back toward the door, my hand fumbling for the handle. As soon as my fingers touched the cold metal, it did something I'll never forget. It stood up, not on all fours, but upright, its legs straightening into an unnatural, bony stance. Its head stayed tilted, its neck craning as if to keep its eyes locked on me. My stomach twisted as it took a single, shaky step forward on two legs, its movements wrong, jerky and awkward, like it was learning how to walk. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The fire crackled behind me, but the warmth felt distant. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear. For a moment, there was nothing but the wind. Then I heard it, scraping. The faint, deliberate sound of claws against wood. My stomach sank as it moved to the window, the sound following it like it was circling the cabin. I grabbed the rifle I'd brought for emergencies, my hands shaking as I loaded it. The scratching stopped suddenly, and the silence pressed in like a weight. I stared at the door, waiting, every nerve in my body screaming. And then came the voice. It was quiet, almost a whisper, and it came from just outside the door. Help, me. My blood ran cold. It wasn't right. The voice was off, like a recording that had been warped. The tone was flat, the words stretched out unnaturally. Help me, it repeated, this time louder, insistent. I raised the rifle, pointing it at the door, but my hands were trembling too much to keep steady. The voice came again, and this time it was closer, pressed against the wood, just inches away. Please. I stepped back, my chest heaving. The voice stopped, replaced by silence so complete it made my ears ring. I stood there for what felt like hours, the rifle clutched to my chest, waiting for it to come back. But it didn't. When dawn broke, I finally dared to open the door. The porch was empty, the trees still and quiet in the cold morning air. But on the ground, just outside the door, were marks long, deep gouges in the wood that didn't look like they came from any animal I'd ever seen. I packed up and left that morning, leaving behind the firewood, the coffee pot, and the unfinished story. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't natural. It wasn't supposed to be here. It was one of those long, quiet nights where the ticking of the clock seemed louder than usual. The November air had a sharp edge to it, and the cold seeped into the house despite the heater humming softly in the background. I had just finished cleaning up after dinner, the faint scent of soap lingering on my hands as I settled into the couch with a book. The house felt still, the kind of stillness that would normally comfort me. But tonight, there was something off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the silence felt heavier, like it was holding its breath. The first sound was barely noticeable, just a faint shuffle. I told myself it was the wind, brushing leaves against the side of the house. Still, I found myself pausing, holding the book mid-page and straining to listen. Nothing. I shook my head and laughed softly. "You're being ridiculous." But even as I went back to reading, a knot formed in the pit of my stomach. A second sound came, sharper this time, like the scrape of something against wood. My eyes darted to the window. The curtains were drawn, the fabric swaying slightly from the warm air of the heater. My heart rate quickened. It's just a branch, I thought. Maybe the wind picked up. But I could feel my pulse in my throat as I stood and walked to the window. I hesitated for a moment before pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek out. The street was quiet, the houses dark. Nothing moved except for the branches of the trees swaying gently in the wind. I stepped back and turned to head upstairs. That's when I heard it. The faint, unmistakable creak of a floorboard coming from the kitchen. I froze in place, my ears straining to catch another sound. The heater clicked off, plunging the house into total silence. For a moment, nothing happened. And then it came again. The slow, deliberate sound of weight shifting on wood. I wasn't alone. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the floor. Slowly, I turned my head toward the darkened kitchen doorway, my breath shallow and quick. The lights were off, and the faint glow from the living room lamp barely reached into the room. I could see nothing but shadows. For a moment, I thought about calling out, asking if someone was there, but the words caught in my throat. I didn't want to confirm what I already knew. Instead, I stepped backward, careful to keep my movements slow and quiet. My phone was still on the coffee table, and if I could just grab it, I could call for help. My eyes stayed locked on the kitchen doorway as I reached for the phone, my fingers brushing against its smooth surface. Then a new sound, breathing, low and steady, just audible enough to make my blood run cold. It was coming from the kitchen, from someone standing just out of sight. I grabbed the phone and bolted for the stairs, my heart hammering so loudly I thought it might drown out my footsteps. I made it to my bedroom and locked the door, shoving a chair under the knob for good measure. My hands shook as I dialed 911. The operator's calm voice somehow both reassuring and terrifying as I whispered the details. "There's someone in my house." The minutes stretched endlessly as I crouched by the bed, the phone clutched tightly to my ear. I heard nothing now. No footsteps, no breathing, no creaks of the floorboards. It was almost worse than the noise. The silence made every shadow seem alive, every faint whisper of the wind a threat. The dispatcher assured me that officers were on their way, but the thought of waiting felt unbearable. I held my breath, straining to hear anything beyond the pounding of my own heart. And then the doorknob rattled. It was soft at first, almost testing. The chair under the knob shifted slightly, scraping against the floor. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp. The rattling grew more insistent, the door shaking as whoever was on the other side tried to force it open. "Please," I whispered into the phone, tears prickling at my eyes. "They're at my door." The sound stopped abruptly, leaving the room eerily quiet once more. I could hear the dispatcher asking if I was still there, but I didn't dare speak. My ears were trained on the silence, waiting for the next sound. Suddenly, the faint wail of sirens cut through the night. Relief flooded me as the sound grew louder, closer. I heard heavy footsteps descending the stairs, fast and deliberate. The front door slammed, and then the house fell silent again. The officers arrived moments later, bursting through the front door and calling out. I unlocked my bedroom door cautiously, my legs trembling as I stepped out to meet them. They found no one. The back door was open, the lock broken. Whoever had been in the house was gone, vanishing into the night as quickly as they had appeared. The officers assured me they would patrol the area, that I would be safe now. But as I sat on the couch hours later, surrounded by the eerie quiet of the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. The crunch of gravel under my boots was the only sound as I walked along the narrow, unlit road. The November cold was biting, sharp enough to cut through my jacket and sting my face. My breath rose in short, visible clouds, and my flashlight flickered slightly with each uneven step. I was heading back to my car after a long day of hiking, frustrated that I had lost track of time. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, and now the woods around me were pitch black. Even with the flashlight, the shadows seemed alive, pressing closer every time I glanced away. I had parked at a lot about 2 miles from the trailhead, thinking nothing of it earlier in the day. Now, as I trudged along the isolated road, every instinct screamed that I should not have waited so long to leave. But I was not superstitious. This was just a walk. A lonely, cold walk. Then I heard it. At first I thought it was just the wind moving through the trees. A faint rustling, maybe. But then it came again. A deliberate snap, like a foot on a twig. I froze. The light from my flashlight jittered as my hand trembled slightly. Slowly, I swept the beam across the dense forest. Nothing. I exhaled shakily and told myself to relax. It was probably an animal, a deer, or maybe a raccoon scavenging in the underbrush. But as I started walking again, I could not shake the feeling that I was not alone. Another snap. This time it was closer, and not subtle. The kind of sound that gets under your skin. My heart kicked into overdrive, hammering against my ribs. I quickened my pace, trying to keep calm, but my breaths were shorter now, my hands clammier despite the cold. "Hello?" I called out, my voice hoarse. The word barely made it out of my throat before dissolving into the silence. No response, just the whisper of leaves in the wind. I hated how cliché it felt, like I was asking to be a horror movie victim. But what else was I supposed to do? The road ahead seemed endless, the beam of my flashlight illuminating nothing but gravel and weeds. My car was still at least a mile away. I cursed myself for coming out here alone. I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. But that time, I could swear I had felt something. A presence. The sensation of being watched was so strong it felt physical, like a hand hovering just above my shoulder. I spun back around and forced myself to keep moving. Then I heard the sound again. Not a snap this time. Footsteps. Clear, heavy, deliberate. They were not trying to be quiet anymore. I turned around fully, swinging the flashlight wildly across the forest. My pulse was deafening in my ears. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Who would be out here, this far from anything, at this hour? The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, gripping the flashlight so hard my knuckles ached. The beam caught on something, a shape, standing just beyond the tree line. A tall, shadowy figure. They were not moving, just watching. "Who's there?" I demanded, forcing as much steel into my voice as I could. No answer. Just the silhouette, motionless. I did not wait for a response. Turning back toward the road, I started jogging, then running. I did not care how ridiculous it looked or sounded. I just needed to get to my car. Behind me, the footsteps started again. Faster this time. The gap between us was shrinking. I could hear their weight on the gravel now, their strides long and unrelenting. I forced myself to look straight ahead, my legs burning as I sprinted harder than I ever had in my life. The parking lot came into view. My car was the only one there, sitting under the dim orange glow of a single sputtering streetlight. Relief surged through me, but I did not slow down. I fumbled for my keys in my pocket, my frozen fingers clumsy and slow. Behind me, the footsteps were closing in. I reached my car and yanked the door open, diving inside and slamming it shut behind me. My hands shook so badly it took 3 tries to jam the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I threw it into reverse without looking. As I sped out of the lot, I risked a glance in the rearview mirror. No one was there. The road behind me was empty, just shadows and trees. I laughed nervously, the sound brittle and hollow. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. The cold, the darkness, it had gotten to me. I was safe now. I convinced myself of that as I drove, the heater blasting, my heart rate slowly steadying. But when I pulled into my driveway and got out of the car, I noticed something. A handprint, a single, muddy handprint smeared across the driver's side door.